Okay, everybody, and welcome to part two of our slideshow and our podcast presentation. We'll take off where we left off, and we were basically, with my confused slide, got those fixed, and so we can go right into talking about the legislative branch. The legislative branch, it is a bicameral system. Of course, we know that that means two houses, upper house and lower house, like the United Kingdom, like the United States. I'll remind you all that the Soviet version of the legislature was also called the Duma. The current one is the Duma. That's the lower house. Under Soviet years, it was a Soviet regime. It was a rubber stamp, which means it just kind of met a couple times a year, and it just approved what people already knew was going to happen. Nowadays, it has more power. However, many would argue that under Putin, it has started to lose power, and there are very few members of parties that oppose Putin. But it does have some real powers, and we're going to talk about those in just a moment. But let's talk about how you get elected to Parliament, and we'll go into this in more depth later. Originally, it was single-member district under the first Constitution. Then it was a mix between proportional and single-member district. And now it is a strict proportional representation with a 7% threshold. You need more than 7% to get into Parliament. And that has actually reduced the number of parties that are represented when usually we expect proportional to mean more parties. We'll get back into that one a little bit more later. What can the Duma do? What are its actual powers? Well, quite simply, like any legislature in the world, it initiates, accepts, and or rejects legislation. Their job is to make laws, write laws, all that kind of stuff. This is kind of one of their big powers, their main deal. That's what they work on. They override presidential vetoes. They can do this, however, I don't think it's ever happened, especially not since Putin has come to power. They confirm presidential nominations. The president chooses ministers and governors and also the prime minister himself, and then it goes to the Duma and they vote on it. And they have the right, it's written in the Constitution, they can vote against it. The rule with prime minister is that if they were to reject 3 times the prime minister, in other words, they reject it, it goes back to the president, he sends it again, it goes back. If they did it 3 times, this is the equivalent of what we call the vote of no confidence in the United Kingdom. And if you get that vote of no confidence, then they're required to dissolve, the president, is required to dissolve the Duma and call for new elections. Here it is in Moscow, the Duma. And I'll just show you a couple of historic pictures. This is the first opening of the Duma by the Tsar. So the Duma's been around back when it was a monarchy. It was around under the Soviet era. And now flash forward to the present, and we have Putin addressing today's Duma, or a few years ago. Anyways. So the Duma cannot do certain things. They have very little influence on the budget. They have no power to force the executive branch. They can't make the president execute laws, which is usually the executive branch's job. But if they choose not to do it, the legislature can't do anything about it. Also, I will point out that there's an upper house, and that's the Federation Council. The Federation Council, a little bit like our Senate, has 2 people from each region, and they represent local interests. How are they chosen? Very different from the American system. One is selected by the governor, and guess who appointed governors? Remember, that's Putin. So he has a lot of say over who's in this council. And one is selected by those regional legislatures. So that's your old double distillation, if you remember that from American history. So we move on. What can they do? The Federation Council is an approval house. They approve laws and bills that come past them. So the budget has to be approved by them. Again, I'm not familiar with them ever disapproving of anything like that. The taxation, any tax laws or tax rules has to be approved by them. Appointments to the Constitutional Court have to be approved. And declarations of war, state of emergency. And I'll point out that these are all pretty much powers of the president that then get approved by the Federation Council. And that includes international treaties as well. So that's your Federation Council. And then we have what we call, in quotes, the government. And I don't mean like the whole government, but what they call the government. And in England, for example, that would be the Prime Minister, the Deputy Prime Minister, and all of his ministers. Well, same thing here in Russia. The government is that group of people that is the real power brokers, decision makers. They are not members of parliament in the way they are in the United Kingdom. So ministers are all named separately. They're not also elected. And the prime minister was not chosen by parliament either, remember. He was chosen by the president. They are the ones who will write the budget. They are the ones who will be in charge of almost all public policy decisions. They propose laws at the same time that the Duma can do that. They are subject, this is important, to a vote of no confidence by the Duma. The Duma could vote no confidence, but they would have to do it 2 times, 2 votes of no confidence in a 3-month period. And then that would be a true no confidence, under which the president would now be forced to dismiss his government or dissolve the Duma. Okay, keep in mind that in a parliamentary system that would be the prime minister, but here we have the president doing it. So it's complex. Make sure you get that down. All right, let's look just for a moment at the judicial branch. The judicial branch of Russia is made up mainly of its constitutional court and its Supreme Court. Also, like the legislature, used to be a rubber stamp, no real power. There have been some promises to reform. However, it's still considered to be a very corrupt system. And we'll have a little short reading, and we'll talk more about that later, early next week, actually. So this brings us back to the question that snuck its way earlier into the presentation. Identify 2 features that make Russia mixed presidential and parliamentary. Be a great short answer question, and you would answer it by giving examples of how it's presidential. A couple of simple ones. The president is directly elected. There's a fixed election cycle. It's every 4 years, soon to become every 6 years. The president may veto Duma legislation. That's a classic way that presidential systems work. Presidents can be impeached. However, it's highly unlikely and highly difficult. What about parliamentary system? What makes it look like a parliamentary system? Well, they have an irregular election cycle. They can call them whenever they want. They can dismiss them if they need to and then re-elect. They do the votes of confidence, although they need 2 or more in certain cases. Prime minister is in some ways accountable to the Duma. They can do a vote of no confidence, but it's difficult and complicated, so it's a little different than what we're used to in the United Kingdom. What makes this a mixed system? It's a little bit of an American presidential style. It's a little bit of a UK style. Here's one of the key points. The president nominates the prime minister. There's not a lot of countries where that happens. The president can dissolve the legislature. That's pretty unique, an executive branch dissolving the legislative branch. There is a dual executive. There is power sharing between a president and a prime minister. You have both. There are also not a lot of systems like this. Which brings us to the question, when we talk about system, we look at the electoral system that is Russia. So turn to Roman numeral 2 in your notes, and we're going to get into this idea of illiberal democracy, but I'm going to define that one a little bit later. There have been 9 elections in Russia so far since it's been the modern Russia. There have been 5 elections to the Duma, to the parliament, and there have been 4 elections for the president. All right, and we've got what we call a triple shift in terms of the electoral system, how you get elected, especially we're talking about here to parliament. We'll get to the president later. In 1990, as I said earlier, it was purely single-member district. In 1993, and I put the full details in your notes, they copied the German system, 450 seats in the House, half of them being chosen by single-member district, and half being chosen by proportional representation, with a 5% threshold. I stress that, a 5% threshold. Now, what this meant for Germany was that you had a lot of major parties, not a lot, but you had a handful of major parties, and they were winning more or less the same amount of seats in each. It was showing that it was good to have the best of both worlds, but it was kind of balancing itself out. Russia had kind of a unique response to this. In Russia, when it was half and half, proportional representation went to the powerful parties, Putin's party, for example. But in single-member district, you had hundreds, literally hundreds of candidates, totally independent, no party, but they were popular in their little regions, in their districts, and they got themselves elected. And so you had this almost chaotic sense in the Duma, and somebody like Putin felt like he couldn't control the legislature as easily, which led him in 2003 to first require a national spread, all right, a requirement that each party, to get elected, you had to have a party with offices all over the country. So you couldn't just be a regional power broker, all right? And then, to make it even stricter, in 2005, they made this announcement, which doesn't go into effect until 2007, so 2 years later, that you had to have just proportional representation. Let's get rid of the SMD with a 7% threshold. The result is that we will narrow down even further the number of parties in Parliament. There's only 4 now, and at least 2 of them are behind Putin. So there's very little true opposition left. This changing in the system has effectively removed opposition from the Russian government. One or two last things before I end. The local government system in Russia is based on a system that we call asymmetric federalism. This is an idea based on the fact that power is devolved or shared unequally across the country and its regions. All right, you've got an enormous number. If you look at the map here, you've got oblasts, which are basically provinces. You've got districts, which are the okrugs. You've got territories, republics. Some of them are semi-autonomous. Some of them have their own constitutions and languages and presidents. Those are the ones that are not culturally Russian. You've got federal cities that have their own separate operation system. And you've got, what's the other thing I was going to say? Well, that's kind of it. So look around the map and you can see how incredibly complicated the system is and how complex it is. And the powers that each region have are dependent often on what they were able to negotiate from Putin. Now we move on to one last thing, and then we're going to end this, and that is the kind of democracy that we have in Russia. What do we call it? Some call it pan-democracy. We've seen managed democracy, procedural democracy, super-presidentialism. Let's try to define at least one of these key terms, and that is substantive democracy. Actually, we're trying to define, I'll go back for a second, procedural democracy, and we do that by contrasting it to substantive democracy. A substantive democracy, and here's your definition, is one in which the electoral process gives all citizens the opportunity to equal participation and they hold truly free, fair, frequent, and competitive elections. We move on. It's important to note that the opposite is our procedural democracy, and it's one where you have elections, but they're not really fair, frequent, or competitive. It's also a system in which, a democracy in which citizens have the symbols or trappings of the democratic process, but they carry far less influence than in the more traditional or substantive democracies. So the whole process is there, but it doesn't really seem real. It doesn't have a real translation to democracy. It's more than just elections, right? We'll also point out that it's a system in which citizens may be able to elect their officials, but they have very little real influence on any policy or legislation or execution, unlike what we claim in substantive democracies like in the United Kingdom or in America. This is basically the exact same thing as the term illiberal democracy that I mentioned earlier. You could also define illiberal democracy as a system in which questionable democratic procedures exist. And I'm going to end us there. We'll continue on later. Thank you very much.